Thank you, everyone, for coming to panel 8. And we've been talking a lot about the great power competition between the United States, China, Russia today. And we're going to talk a little bit about the technological aspects of this now on this panel. We're going to talk about whether we're in a technological Cold War. We have a great panel today. I'm going to introduce them, and then we're going to dive into a question for each of them before we get into our conversations. I'll remind you all, as you know by now, you can submit questions via the forum app or by Twitter with the appropriate hashtag. So let me introduce first the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Adam Smith, who will be the honoree tonight. We have next Representative Gallagher, who of Wisconsin, Republican of Wisconsin. If you haven't read his Reagan Institute paper, I would commend to you all go and take a look at that. General Paul Nakasone, the head of U.S. Cyber Command, the National Security Agency, who will today answer Roger's question from the earlier presentation about foosball at Fort Meade. And then we have Brad Smith of Microsoft, who has written a book, and with several chapters of which really get to the questions we're going to be dealing with today about how American companies, America itself, should deal with China and technology. Chairman, I want to start with you. Sure. And you're a forum regular. You always mix it up here on these panels. You keep them lively. I'm counting on you.
You gave me a very friendly group this year. I don't see who I'm going to fight with this time, but I appreciate that. So.
Well, I hope you'll pick on someone.
I have a bad feeling that's going to be me.
Yeah. Is it helpful for us to think of the United States as in a Cold War with China? Is that a useful way to look at this problem?
Well, I think it is helpful for us to think of ourselves as being in sort of another ideological struggle. You know, it was capitalism and democracy versus communism for a long time. Now the ideological struggle is basically freedom versus authoritarianism, economic and political freedom. On the one hand, you have capitalism and democracy. On the other hand, you have sort of kleptocracy and autocracy. And what's really different now, obviously we've had autocratic regimes across the world for forever. But Russia in particular is actively trying to promote the idea that autocracy is better than democracy, and at the same time trying to mess with democracy. They're trying to show the world by messing with our elections, by stirring up controversy. Democracy doesn't work. These people, they're rabble. They can't possibly govern themselves. And China, and I'll be interested, there's people in this panel who know more about it than I do, China's starting to step across that line in a way that I don't think 10 years ago they did. Before, their position was, this is our government, you guys do whatever you want to do. But I think Xi sees that, well, we have to promote this globally, just like Putin, so that the people in China and the people in Russia don't start getting any ideas, don't start thinking that they want more freedom, that, well, democracy just doesn't work. This is the better system of government. And this plays into the stuff that Brad wrote about, and it's about, how do we get the technological edge? How do we make technology a force for freedom instead of a force for authoritarianism? And how do we prove that our way is better? That our way is going to lead to more prosperity, less war, more peace. And right now, my biggest concern, I'll close with this, is China and Russia, they're fighting this battle, okay? They're out there promoting we're not really engaged as a country right now out there aggressively promoting the idea that economic and political freedom works, and it's better. We're not fully engaged in that fight in a way that I'm deeply worried about.
Representative Gallagher, we've heard a lot, both this year and even at last year's forum, about the need to protect the supply chain from Chinese IP theft or cyber attacks. But you've written that we need to think about this much more broadly than that, about Chinese influence in the industrial base with a wider picture, not just a cyber attack. Talk to us a little bit about how you see this problem.
Well, first let me say, I think everything Chairman Smith said is on point, and I think that's incredibly well said. And I know there's debate about whether to use the Cold War as the right analogy, but to the extent it simply conveys the scope of the challenge, I do think it's useful. But it's also useful to think what's different, right? What makes this competition in some ways an order of magnitude more complex and more difficult than our competition with the Soviet Union. And the most obvious thing, as anyone who works in industry here knows, is because unlike the Soviet Union, our economies are so thoroughly intertwined. And so the most difficult question I think we need to ask is, to what extent do we need to decouple economically from China? This has become a bit of a straw man recently. You've had the foreign minister of China talk about the delusions of decoupling. You've had our former Treasury Secretary talk about the dangers of decoupling. But I think there are at least two problems with that narrative. One, we've never been fully coupled with China in the first place. And let me step back and say, no one in this room actually has a problem with American consumers buying Chinese t-shirts. No one in this room has a problem with Chinese consumers buying soybeans that we grow in Wisconsin, right? We're not talking about a full decoupling. And then second, we've never been fully coupled in the sense that we have an arms embargo that goes back to Tiananmen. And the argument I make in the Reagan essay is that this is actually the biggest thing that Reagan got wrong, right? Reagan in 1988 goes to Moscow State University. He gives this incredible speech talking about this very idea that economic freedom, technological progress would lead towards liberalization and political freedom, specifically in China. He singles out China, and of course Tiananmen happens the next year, and we're at this point, this unique point, decades later, where we have Republicans, Democrats, everybody in between agreeing on the same exact premise. I left this conference last year just marveling at how remarkable it is that no one in this room is taking exception to the fundamental premise of the National Defense Strategy. That is an amazing thing, and that's what this panel is about. But I do think we are going to have to think about how do we, if not decouple entirely, redefine the parameters of commerce in a way where American companies can continue to thrive, that we can better defend our interests and our values in ways that we are not doing right now. It's going to require us to better invest and protect foundational technologies, ensure the integrity of our supply chain, ensure we're free from economic coercion, which we're not right now, and ensure transparency in our capital markets. But the good news is I think, I'm sitting here nodding when Chairman Smith is talking about China. It suggests there is a huge reservoir of bipartisan support, or at least a lot of goodwill in Congress to work on these issues responsibly. And I think it's a great opportunity. I can't think of anything else, with the possible exception of Baby Yoda, that unites the country right now.
Baby Yoda is indeed awesome. General, first, how important are the foosball tables to recruiting a class at the NSA? And tell us how you see in the cyber landscape this competition with China. What's going on? What are you dealing with on when it comes to competition with China?
So first of all, Julian, before I answer those foundational questions, let me just first of all thank the Reagan Institute and my distinguished panelists here. Really an honor to be here at the library of my first Commander-in-Chief, President Reagan. I think Chairman Smith really talked very well in terms of where we're seeing the landscape. And let me talk about it in terms of great power competition. What are we seeing our adversaries doing today to us in cyberspace? We see three major things. Stealing our intellectual property. Tremendous loss of intellectual property across the majority of sectors in our economy. Secondly, stealing our personal identifiable information. And thirdly, trying to interfere in our democratic processes. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that. But those three areas are foundation of what we're seeing our adversaries do. Where? Below the level of armed conflict. This is what great power competition looks like to us today. So, what are we doing? We are engaging based upon the tenets of the National Defense Strategy to move forward, with a strategy of defend forward, with persistent engagement. The idea that we cannot wait for our adversaries to steal our intellectual property or take our personally identifiable information or interfere in our elections. So this idea of being able to enable our partners and to act when authorized. Those are the things we're doing today. This is how the landscape has changed. And I think, rightly so, this is how we've changed as a government and certainly as the Department of Defense.
Brad, I want you in your opening remarks to touch, if you can, a little bit on one of the big questions this panel is supposed to start to tackle of what are China's advantages and disadvantages and what are America's advantages and disadvantages when we look at this sort of technological Cold War, if that's an appropriate word.
Sure. I mean, and obviously we have the benefit of working around the world, and I would, first of all, echo the General's comments. It's an honor for us as a company to be here. When you see China today, you see a robust economy with a very talented and large group of scientists and engineers in a diversified way that the Soviet Union really never had in terms of either number or of individuals or number of disciplines. You see a country that is fast catching up with the United States in the creation of technologies like artificial intelligence. And you see a country that has a very large population, 1.4 billion people. All of those actually are extremely important when we think about what it means for the United States. Well, why? Well, I would say because our sense is we're entering probably 3 or 4 decades when really the most defining technology and invention in the world, the invention that will reshape everything else, is AI. Much like the combustion engine did in the first half of the 20th century. It's worth recalling, I think, that when war broke out in Europe in September of 1939, it started with tanks and airplanes, 2 weapons that didn't exist when the century began, but 2 weapons that were made possible by one thing, the combustion engine. It changed every part of every economy and every society, and AI will as well. So now, when we think about the United States, we are the technology leader in this space today. We have more technology companies, we have more innovators, we have more venture capital than any other nation. We have more people who've come to our shores from the rest of the world than any other country has. But we don't have as many people. Does that matter? The answer is yes, it does. Because whereas oil was the fuel for the combustion engine, data is the fuel for AI. And unlike a gasoline tank, an AI model can take an infinite amount of data. The more data you can collect, the faster you will move your AI forward. And so there's a real question. Can a country with 320 million people for 4 or 5 decades create as much data as a country with 1.4 billion people? The number of people actually matter. So in a sense, it brings me to what I think is actually the most important strength that we have. It is exactly the same strength that won the Cold War. It's allies with common values. I think it's worth remembering that the Cold War started before World War II ended. I think it started the day Wernher von Braun moved his team of 500 engineers from the part of Germany that would be captured by the Soviet Union to the part of Germany where he could surrender to the United States. And it ended when the Berlin Wall fell. And the most famous 6 words of the Cold War were uttered by Ronald Reagan. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. It was about alliances, it was about values, it was about bringing people together. And it won't be the same kind of challenge, but I have to believe that those are the things that will define the difference.
Chairman, Brad just outlined this idea of sharing data among allies. Are our alliances in the kind of state right now where they will trust the United States with their data, where they want to work with the United States in a competition against China? The fight to persuade allies not to use Huawei has a mixed record at best. What do you think about the prospects for success there?
I think this is an enormous challenge. I don't think we're in as good a place as we should be, and I think we need to focus a lot of effort and resources on figuring out how to rebuild and strengthen those alliances on many fronts, but precisely along the whole data sharing issue. And we can't underestimate, the impact that Edward Snowden had on all of this. I mean, everyone was kind of vaguely aware that, we were, spying on each other, but that sent it out to absolutely everybody in a way. And even if the leaders of the other countries could say, okay, we know they're doing it, but it's okay. Now their constituents knew it. And they're like, you're letting these people, and I think it did help start to drive this apart. And the other thing is, and you urge me to start a fight. I'm not trying to start a fight with this. I just think it needs to be said. Our president's disdain for alliances is a problem. Now, I understand, and I've talked with them that, well, we're just trying to put pressure on them so they'll do more. And that's fine, but it goes beyond that. I mean, if you're in the rest of the world, you think that President Trump basically is like, I don't care about the rest of you. I don't care about the alliances. I mean, the amount of time we spend insulting our partners makes it more difficult to then pull them together. And I want to see that changed. And also, I think it is problematic that our president praises autocrats as often as he does. I mean, I'm happy he's talking to Kim Jong-un. It's better than going to war there. But you don't have to praise him so much while at the same time tearing down the Democratic leaders. And whether we like it or not, nobody on this panel has 100th of the influence that the President of the United States does. I was in Erbil, and I woke up in the morning, turned on the TV, and there's the President talking about how we're in Syria to take their oil. That hurts. Okay, so if there's anything we could do to alter that message coming from the top, because the answer to your question, quite frankly, where are we at? We're in trouble on the alliances, in my view. Now, the systems have been built over 75 years. NATO was built over that time. All these things were built. They're not going to crumble like that. And so we have the strength of that, but we got to start generating some positive to offset the negative, or it's going to be a real problem. And Brad's right. I mean, that's our strength. Is, okay, China's got all their people, but nobody really is allied with China. We have allies all over the world. We need to build on that.
General, could you weigh in on this? How much, the argument against Huawei by the United States government was we cannot allow China to suck up all the data. Some of the argument back has occasionally been, well, the NSA does it, so what's the difference? You've gone out to partners, to allies, to talk to them. How are they viewing the United States? Is the Edward Snowden era behind us? How much do they want to work with the United States and compete against China? What have you seen out there?
Yeah, so Julian, as we talk about 5G, I think the first thing that we always emphasize is just the huge change that this is going to bring to a society. In many ways, it's going from radio to TV. I mean, that's the picture that I try to paint, and certainly one that I think is pretty apropos as we start thinking about what this means at the end point of a device. And so I think the discussion really becomes, with this device, with this data that's so readily available, do you feel comfortable having a nation that doesn't share your values, that has an Orwellian scoring system for its own people, that has an ability to utilize this for malfeasance based upon the connections that they have with their own industry? If that is security for you, then you shouldn't worry about the Chinese in Huawei and Chinese within your network. The challenge that we have had, and I think the challenge that we continue to need to address with our partners is there a comfort there and is there a mitigation? We don't see the mitigation in terms of being able to do that and have the feeling that you're secure with a nation that I just described being within your infrastructure.
Representative Gallagher, every person in this room has in their pocket a phone that was either made in China or has significant Chinese components. Is that a national security threat to us?
Well, I think certainly allowing Huawei and ZTE to dominate the foundation architecture of 5G internet is a national security threat. It could be game, set, match for this ongoing great power competition between the U.S. And China. At least that's what all the smart people I've been having meals with here at the Reagan National Defense Forum have been telling me, right? And I think it's worth thinking about. It's the chairman's right to suggest, Brad and I were at the Munich Security Conference last year, Brad, by the way, is an Appleton, Wisconsin native. That's my district. Not since the great Joseph McCarthy has someone so prominent from Appleton, Wisconsin.
Wow.
Yeah, exactly.
Different view of the world.
Houdini grew up there too, so.
That's true. The Houdini Museum. And Pence gave this great speech. He had this great line. He said, "We cannot ensure the defense of the West if our allies are dependent on the East." Basically getting at this very issue, right? But it's clear that it fell on deaf ears. Now, whether that's a result of our allies being ticked off over rhetoric or whether they just want cheap internet and Chinese foreign direct investment, I don't know. It's probably a little bit of both. All I know is that on the current course, I do not think we are going to win the competition for 5G. People are buying the Huawei narrative right now. Huawei is dominating the global telecommunications market. In 2015, they had a quarter of the market. They have 35% now. Nokia and Ericsson are 16 and 11% respectively. It's worth asking whether non-Huawei Western-aligned alternatives will even be around for the 6G and beyond competition. And I think in part we failed to make the defensive case because all we've talked about is Huawei allowing the CCP to spy on you, right? That's obvious. That's true. Read the Finite States report. Read open source reporting about what happened in the African Union. But it's not really about that. It's about Huawei driving all of its competitors out of business and dominating, gaining a monopoly or a near monopoly on the global telecommunications market. Then things get really interesting and really dystopian for us and for all of our allies around the world, because that's when the CCP can flip the script on export controls, condition the transfer of underlying technology, which they will now own, on adopting the CCP's Orwellian views on censorship and surveillance. And if you're a country that wants to resist that, good luck, because Huawei systems are built to be non-interoperable with other alternatives, which means ripping it up and replacing it is cost prohibitive. Brad is absolutely right that the worst thing we could do in this is to go it alone. That's how we lose. If we build a digital Fortress America, just like attempts to build a Fortress America in the late 1930s and early 40s, it will absolutely fail. Our best weapon is our alliances. In Brad's book, he talks about 80% of the world is not China. We have to win these arguments in foreign capitals. We're having some success in places like Japan and Vietnam, mixed bag in Britain right now. There's a potential sea change happening in Germany right now that we should capitalize on. All I know is that it seems like, from everybody I've talked to who's smarter than me, we are on the course to losing this competition, and the stakes are incredibly high, if not existential.
Let's put up the slide that we have from the survey, which is Americans agree with the national defense strategy. Our authoritarian competitors pose the greatest threat to the U.S. And China comes in at the top, 28%, and then Russia at 25%. There was another interesting question, too, that's been referred to by Representative Cheney at the first panel about America's competition on AI and cyber with the rest of the world. And it makes the point that a majority think the U.S. is only one of the best and not the best. Brad, does that matter? Does the U.S. have to be the best at this suite of technologies, or is parity good enough?
Well, I think we should aspire to lead, and that means being the best. Why wouldn't we aspire to lead? I think that one needs to pursue a strategy for leadership that creates opportunities for success for our allies and other democracies as well. We really developed the strategic paradigm for the Cold War, if you will, when we combined the creation of NATO with the Marshall Plan to invest in Europe. And I don't think that the coming decade is a decade where you would expect to see the United States invest in Europe technologically, but there's a huge opportunity for us to invest together. Really, even when you talk about 5G, if we can persuade other countries to pursue a strategy that recognizes the unique characteristics and just strategic importance of 5G, it creates the foundation for an approach that says that like-minded democratic nations should procure this technology only from companies that are based in other like-minded democratic nations, which paves the way for two of Europe's leading technology companies, Nokia and Ericsson, as well as South Korea's Samsung, to be among the technology leaders for the world. And so, I think that we should aspire to leadership in that form. I think we should aspire to leadership in terms of accelerating research in the United States in key areas. I think we should make sure we're continuing to attract the best talent in the world to come here to work on these projects. I think we should absolutely aspire to lead in making sure that our young people are at least as well prepared as any group of young people anywhere in the world to have the skills that they'll need for the future.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Gallagher, I want you both to weigh in. What is the role of government in pushing some of these technologies, creating a competitor to Huawei? Should the federal government help invest in pick winners in the AI, the race to develop AI or other technologies?
Well, that's exactly the question that was coming to my mind when Mike was speaking, and I'm more curious actually what Brad has to say about that. Off the top, I say yes. I think it is the infrastructure of the present and certainly of the future, and the U.S. ought to be more. Now, can we do that in an effective way? I mean, that's the question. Build roads and bridges and all that, but if we start getting involved in technology, it gets complicated. And I would think the Department of Defense should play a central role in this as well. They have an incredible investment in developing the new 5G technology, and it would make sense for them, and I think the American government, to help do that, because the biggest problem we had is when Huawei was rising, Nokia and Ericsson, but U.S. was disappearing, like completely from this market. And I don't know enough about the markets to know, but I think it would be really great if we had a domestic U.S. company that rose up to at least be able to compete. And I think we ought to invest in doing that. And I forget, there's a company that's working on some of the 5G technology, former Microsoft guy who I met with, who talked about doing just that. How do is that possible, or is that just crazy? So I'm curious to know if the industry folks think that's something we could do.
Representative Gallagher, sometimes that seems like industrial policy to Republicans. What do you think? Is this but in the case of national security emergencies, then it's sometimes justifiable.
Well, there's a defensive role that has been where we've mostly played, putting Huawei and ZTE putting Huawei on the entities list. ZTE had a denial order that disappeared in the context of negotiations with China. We don't need to go down that road right now.
It'd be fun to, though.
It would be very fun. I was not on the conference committee. I'm hoping my Huawei entities list amendment will survive the conference committee, Mr. Chairman. Also, we've done bipartisan things like taking a look at the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, strengthening it with FIRMA in the last Congress, but we have not played offense. And it is my opinion that offense will require some form of industrial policy or whatever you want to call it, right? I think even if we were able to make this defensive case better than we are in Munich, in London, in whatever cities exist in Canada, it still wouldn't be enough. We are not investing enough resources into non-Huawei, Western-aligned alternatives. I can imagine some sort of digital development fund where you take countries like the US, Finland, Norway, South Korea to help level the financial playing field so that countries that are making decisions on 5G aren't doing it solely on price point where we can't compete right now. I think we should take a look at our antitrust and our anti-cartel laws to allow non-Huawei Western-aligned alternatives to do bids together in a way that provides soup-to-nut solutions for people making 5G decisions. And finally, I think it's incumbent upon every public figure in Congress, in the White House, everyone that has a platform to talk exactly about what Chairman Smith started this panel with, which is what's at stake morally here? What's at stake in terms of U.S. values versus CCP values? I think it's been interesting to see. I wrote a letter, for example, to the NBA after the latest controversy. The co-signers were Tom Cotton, Ted Cruz, and AOC. Show me another issue in American politics that unites that disparate of members of Congress. So I think there's an opportunity, but we're certainly not doing enough.
General, at Cyber Command NSA, you've talked about your strategy of defending forward persistent engagement. The U.S. has been in a bit of a conflict with Iran below the level of armed conflict, which in public reports have talked about a cyber aspect of that. Does this exist with China? Is there a jabbing back and forth, a gray zone conflict with China, or what would it look like if that was to break out?
So let me talk a little bit more broadly in terms of what our strategy is, because I think that's an important piece. So the Department of Defense's strategy of Defend Forward, the idea of being able to engage our adversaries before it hits the shores of our country. Within U.S. Cyber Command, the National Security Agency, it's about persistent engagement. This idea that we will enable our partners with information and intelligence, and we will act when authorized. This is the way forward for us. We have shown this in terms of the defense of our midterm elections in 2018. This is the way that we've structured our force. This is the way that we've developed our doctrine. This is the way that we engage our adversaries. And while I won't go into specific countries, this is our method upon which we look at the future and say, this is how we have an impact on our adversaries. It's not just the fact that we wait for the next penetration. It's the idea that when we have information, we share that information. And when it's necessary to act and we're authorized to act, we will certainly act to make sure that we're able to defend our nation.
As a moderator, I get to mention specific countries with ease, and obviously Russia has interfered with American elections or attempted to. We've also learned a lot that their tactics are shifting. And what are you doing at your commands to try to keep pace, stay ahead of them? These are constantly shifting threats as Chairman Smith said, of the authoritarian regimes that are kind of actively sort of pushing out ideologically against us.
In 332 days, our nation's going to elect a president. But we began the ability for us to defend the presidential elections, not today, not 6 months from now. We began it the day after the midterm elections. We have not let up in terms of our ability to understand what our adversaries are going to do. There are 3 things that we're going to do in support of a whole-of-government effort to secure our elections. First of all, we're going to generate insights on all of our adversaries. We're going to know our adversaries better than they know themselves. Secondly, we're going to improve the defenses of our nation, whether or not that's defending against interference, defending against influence, by, with, and through our partners at the Department of Homeland Security and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And then finally, if necessary, we are authorized to act to make sure that our adversaries understand that we will defend our elections. It is similar to what we did in 2018. The difference, however, is the fact that we haven't let up. We can't let up. This is something we cannot be episodic about. The defense of our nation, defense of our elections, is something that will be every single day for as long as I can see into the future.
Brad Smith, was it a mistake for American industry to go into China, to build businesses in China, to create such a partnership there, when now we find ourselves in a much more competitive state? Did we as a country make an error there?
Well, if you're talking about digital technology, I would mostly point out that in some respects, U.S. investment in China has been deep, but mostly it hasn't been broad. There are issues around the development of chips and a supply chain, that do create an economic link that by definition creates a security question, if not a vulnerability. And there are real discussions that are being had and will need to be had about how we as a country think about our supply chain. If you actually look beyond that, there are not very many American technology companies that have had hugely successful businesses in China. China accounts for 18% of the world's people. They account for 1.8% of Microsoft's revenue. So it's not actually a significant part of our business. And to the extent that we've experienced IP theft over the years, as we have, it's because we, in part, had in Windows and Office products that were so easy to copy and use without paying for them. that's just the tip of an iceberg, of a broader issue. I think the real question is, where do we go in the future? And I share what Mike said. I think that there are areas where one needs to think about where our supply chains start and end. But it is an interconnected world. An awful lot of American products today benefited from research that was done in China. A lot of it was published. It's really hard to draw a digital iron curtain down the middle of the Pacific Ocean and think that you can stop scientists from talking with each other. In a world of open source software, for that matter, everybody can use open source components. It's not called theft, it's called sharing. It's the way sort of software creation has gone. So I think mostly what this points to, in my view, is the importance of understanding the details. Almost any one of these questions are not questions that should be taken off the table, but they're questions that need to be thought through carefully. It's as General Nakasone was saying, I think that this approach to developing a much more robust, comprehensive strategy to deal with cyber threats is going to be more effective because it's more robust. And the very first thing you mentioned, understand your adversaries and what they're doing, and then base your strategy on that understanding.
One of America's advantages when we talk about a race to AI, a race to quantum computing, to other technologies that will influence national security, has been the sort of strength and leadership of American tech companies. But there has been some very high-profile cases where companies have walked away from some cooperation with the Pentagon, where employees have protested. How big a hurdle is that tension between Silicon Valley, Seattle on one coast, and Washington on the other? Brad, start.
Well, I think it's a very important issue for us to manage well. Jeff Bezos spoke from the same stage this morning, and he described Amazon's approach. And it's very interesting because we're both in Seattle, and we both have adopted the same position, which is to say we're going to provide our technology to the U.S. military. Jeff spoke as a founder. I worked we really had two generations of founders, in Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer. And as a founder, it can do in a way that's really terrific. He said, look, it's the job of senior leadership to say no. I don't understand the details, but I say no. We no longer are led by a founder. And so we get to the same point, but through a slightly different style of leadership. I think it's really important to start by understanding where people are coming from, so at least we understand why they think the way they do. And it turns out that one of the reasons they think they do is it's a young generation deeply focused on sense of purpose and a commitment to ethics. And once we understand that, we can engage in ongoing communication. And we've been absolutely clear. We will provide everything that we create to the United States military. And we'll also engage on the public policy issues as our employees actually want us to do. But there's two things that I have found make all the difference. The first is helping young or older tech employees learn that the United States military is a deeply ethical institution. It is not only, I'll argue, the most ethical military institution on the planet, it is quite possibly the institution that has operationalized ethics more than any organization on the planet in terms of training and a uniform code of military justice and courts, the whole area. And so once our employees actually understand that you don't graduate from the Air Force Academy or West Point or Annapolis without taking a course in ethics, their eyes light up and they think differently. And the second thing I've found is that when you can talk to employees not only about principles and institutions, but about other people, they then appreciate in a completely new way what we're talking about. And so what I've said repeatedly to our employees is that there are more than 1 million people in the United States military, and every one of them is an individual who shares in common one thing that no employee at any tech company does. Every one of them has pledged that before the sun sets, they will sacrifice their life if that's what they need to keep us safe. Of course, we will provide all of our technology to them. How could we possibly not do that? And when I say that to our employees, every single time, I get the same response. They applaud.
Could I, please? And I think that's absolutely true, and we have to make that case. The other piece of it is, I think we need to make sure that our defense policy reflects that, reflects those values, and that you're right. It starts with listening. Why are they saying this? It's because of their perception of the DoD, like you said, of the Pentagon, of what they do. You know, and so yes, we have to make that case, but we also have to look at the policies that might lead them to believe that, and address those where concerned. And you know, it's part of what I'm trying to do as chairman of the Armed Services Committee, and taking a more progressive viewpoint on it and looking at some of these policies and saying what are the concerns out there for what's going on in Yemen has been a big concern to a lot of these very folks, and are we supporting what is a horrific situation over there? How do we address that policy concern? So I think actually there's a real connection in all this when you look at our national security being completely and totally dependent going forward on technology, on all those very, very smart people who work for you, who are starting their own companies, doing all that stuff. We have got to meld our national security strategy with those values. And I think there are some places where we've fallen short of that. And I completely agree with what you said about the men and women who serve in the military. But I think it would be wrong of us to say, you can't criticize anything that DoD has done or the military has done, or that we shouldn't look at what our policy is to make sure that the policy that we implement at DoD reflects the values that we state. We have to address that because everyone in this room is going to really get behind that. A lot of the people who are saying that Microsoft and all these people shouldn't do business with DoD are going to ask a couple more questions. And I think we have to be prepared to answer those. Now, let me be clear. I think we can. I'm 100% proud, of our national security policy, but there's always room for improvement, and we have to be open to that conversation if we're going to meet those tech objectives. I'll just close with something that I was talking about at the table, the new Space Force, which could get me off on a very, very long story. But, one of the interesting things they said to me was, the Space Force has really got Silicon Valley more excited about working with the Department of Defense than anything that we've done in forever. And I hadn't thought about that. But those are the kind of things we need to think about. In addition to the values, they do really cool. General Nakasone does really cool stuff that is improving the quality of life and creating all manner of possibilities. It is not just about, or even close to just about, dropping bombs, okay? It's about developing new technologies and doing stuff that should really excite these very young, very smart people. It's a complicated case we have to make. It's crucial that we make it.
In our closing minutes, I want to go to the audience questions. I have one question who's digging a little deeper on our earlier decoupling conversation. How should we think about the debate over whether to decouple with China? On one hand, is it even possible? On the other, can we protect our national security technology without it? Representative Gallagher, what?
Well, to be clear, what I'm arguing for is not a total decoupling. It's more of a rebalancing, right? A responsible decoupling. And I do think we have to frame it this way. Which is to say, a Chinese national that wants to join the rest of the world on Twitter, on Facebook, that wants to read the New York Times, that wants to Google their own country's history, is instead forced into a parallel and party-sanitized internet. In other words, what I'm suggesting is that it is the Chinese Communist Party, out of fear of its own citizens' knowledge, that has chosen to decouple itself from the rest of the world. So we have to start from that framing point and then think about where are areas where we actually can afford to decouple responsibly without totally messing with our own businesses, right? One area that is ripe, I think, for this right now is taking a look at our capital markets. This has gotten a lot of attention recently because the board that manages the Federal Thrift Savings Plan, my 401k, and everyone else that works for the federal government has decided to use the MSCI All Country World Index. But the problem is that on that, there's ZTE, there's Hikvision, which is currently on the entities list because this technology is being used to put 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps in Xinjiang, the Aviation Industrial Corps in China, which builds fighters and anti-ship missiles. So this puts us in an awkward position where $3.3 billion of federal employee money, including military service member money, is going to companies that will have a hand in possibly beating us if we go to war with China. It also puts us in an awkward position of denying exports to companies that we are simultaneously funding. And so that is an obvious area where we can subject Chinese companies to the exact same disclosure requirements that we require our own companies when it comes to being able to produce audits, disclose vulnerabilities, whether you're a sanctions violator, a human rights violator, et cetera. And I have to end this by, I encourage, I'm getting no money off this, by the way. Brad's book is for sale out there. It's quite good. It's co-authors in the audience as well. But he talks.
You get $174,000 a year, just like the rest of us.
That's true. That's true. To work with you, I do it for free. I think Microsoft made a very, I think, courageous decision not to host consumer email servers in China. It developed a human rights assessment whenever it decides whether to put a data center there. I mean, that's the type of creative thinking that we need from industry to help us navigate this very complex moment.
We are out of time. We got Representative Gallagher excited there at the end. Please join me in thanking the panel.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it's fun. Yeah. Hey, thank you.
Ladies and